Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us wherever you are in the world. And, on where I am in the settler colony, it's the middle of the day. So, folks who are in the settler colony also, I just want to send out a message of love and solidarity with everybody in LA and folks who are sort of in the streets, um, making sure people know that the overreach of oppression is not forever and that folks rise up and stand in solidarity and of course as always planting ourselves and grounding ourselves in Palestine and with our siblings in Palestine who are also resisting the boot of settler colonialism. I'm so excited about our event today. Eyal and I met in January. I've followed his work for many, many, many years, as probably many of us have, and the work that the incredible team at Forensic Architecture do. I want to send out my love to them as well for all their labor, continuous labor that's been going on for many decades, but certainly they've sort of upped it up a notch or two or three or 10 during the genocide. But the idea around this really started the series we've been doing with the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and thank you, Yulia, for all your work, and Ameya, our director as well, is really a space to generate knowledge and knowledge production around the critical engagement around Zionism. And so I'm just going to ask Yulia to drop in a donate link for any of you who, when you're thinking about sort of where you might give, this space for me feels like a space where we are together generating knowledge that runs counter to the hegemonic idea about what the space of Zionism is and how it can be contested. This series is one of many of those spaces. So this series is about smear campaigns and it's about theorizing smear. So this version, this iteration of that really started when we were thinking about what are the various components or tenets or sort of angles around smear. I started to think about when the smear campaign started against me, how there was a sense that every part of space was being invaded, right? That part of the actual machinery of oppression creates space where then the invasion happens or the attack happens. And so I was being attacked on every platform, every space. And there starts to be a sense that like everything is closing in. So when we were talking about this series, the first thing I found myself associating to was this work and in forensic architecture. And really, I had shared this with him around this documentary that Al Jazeera did many years ago, where Eyal is sort of walking us through the architecture of Zionist oppression and how even the architecture that's there is used to sort of create more spaces of attack, invasion. In this case, they were sort of hammering through homes in Nablus to be able to attack folks in the city and sort of a inversion of private spaces becoming spaces of warfare, that there is no separation between the public space and the private space, and that the Zionist settler army will use any space necessary. So we started to think about how do these things come together, the logics of smear campaigns sort of being expanded into space, architecture. What are the ways in which Zionist expansionism follows these logics in particular ways? And in many ways, I think there's nobody that's more able to speak to these things than Eyal. So I want to
Wow,
welcome
thank you.
you to our space and thank you so much for being in conversation with me. I'm going to drop your bio into the chat so folks can check in. He might not need an introduction, but for those of you who want to read a little bit more about his work, I'll do that. But mainly just so that I can just hand it over to you and we can hear you speak and we can be in conversation. And then hopefully Jessie will also be joining us as well, and we'll kick it over to her when she's in. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to continue the conversation, Lara. And I wonder where should we start? I mean, would you like us um, to start with a proposition that you raised, or?
Yeah, perhaps maybe really start from the place of your work or your conceptualizations around the use or misuse or sort of abuse of space, how you think about it in these ways. We had a sort of
Great.
introductory
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
Go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's important to, for me, the kind of project that began with the mapping of Israeli settler colonialism initially in the West Bank and later in many other parts of Palestine is really to understand settler colonialism as both as two things. It's both destruction, an act of destruction, and an art of construction. So, in a sense, destruction and construction are continuous. Both of them are action on space, actions of space that changes the syntax of everyday use of space. So, and the particular scene that you brought us in is interesting because it connects space and language. And when we are speaking about smear campaign and the relationship between smear campaign and spatial practice, it is maybe a good place to start in speaking about syntax. And so the context of that scene that you described that was depicted in Al Jazeera is a raid on a Palestinian refugee camp of Balata and later on the city center of Nablus that happened in April 2002. And it was the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It was Israel's sort of attempt to occupy once more the Palestinian cities. And what they've done is what they often do when they occupy, invade Palestinian spaces. So when you invade a space as an army, you could, you say the city or the camp or an urban space is a complex space. And if you move through it by accepting its own logic of roads and then alleyways and then doorways and then corridors and doors, this is the syntax of the city. This is how the city is actually dividing its different degrees of privacy and publicity within that. You can one way to invade a space is basically to move within that existing order, to use the vocabulary of the existing spatial vocabulary. But settler colonial violence is always about, it never accepts the existence of places. So, let's compare settler colonial violence to police violence. So, police violence would go into a place, and of course, it is coming from the same order that has imposed the architecture, right? Let's say this is municipal police, and that's been a municipal housing project. And as horrible as it is, there is a unity between the people that have designed the space and the people that have policed that space. In settler colonization, the people that design that space are actually a very, the act of design in the refugee camp is already an act of resistance, meaning the syntax of the camp, whether it is the way that streets and areas in the camp are referring to the villages that were ethnically cleansed in 1948 or in other times. Um, the order of families and communities within a particular area held within the space. The density is also a means of protection. The complexity is a means of protection. And settler colonial violence is simply coming to rewrite that. So it's not that the soldiers would move and accept the existing order, but would seek to, through movement, impose a new order on that, physical facts. So in this particular case, in April 2002, they have actually decided not to accept any of the existing syntax of the city. So any place that was designed by Palestinians as a thoroughfare or as a circulation area or as a public area would be a private area, meaning they will avoid it. And every area that was designated by Palestinians as a private space, a home, a room, etc., will become a thoroughfare. So it's kind of turning it upside down or inside out somehow. And the soldiers were moving from all directions. Their metaphor was like moving like worms in an apple, in a kind of like as if the city, the camp, is a solid, and they could move. They would not use the streets, and they would move between homes by punching walls in party walls and moving across sometimes kilometers long, with never stepping foot on the existing thoroughfares. And they've kind of given sort of like a theoretical veneer to it through readings of Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari, which was incredibly offensive because this is the heroes of
Right.
people that resist all sort of forms of oppression, and somehow they felt themselves entitled to that theory. Um, I want to say that this conception of space, of moving through space, as much as they were kind of showing off about it after they've demolished the center of Balata and Jenin and the Casbah of Nablus, is that this is a classic way in which guerrilla move in cities. And just before I hand back this, from your first question, Lara, I wanna speak about somebody, one of the heroes of the resistance in Gaza that I've just recently came to learn about. Obviously, as an architect, I would be interested in a fellow architect, um, and a Palestinian called Mohammed Al Aswad, who was in the PFLP, arrested in 68, released in 1970, went to China to be trained, came back as the deputy leader of the PFLP. But before he was on this journey, he started his studies of architecture in Cairo, as many Palestinians were at the time. Sorry, that was in the early before the occupation, so that this must have been like mid 60s. He was gone to Cairo University, came back, and invented a set of spatial technologies, let's say, that I think we keep on seeing in the resistance configuration of space. So the first brilliant thing that, that's what that they called him Guevara, like many people in the PFLP, I call Guevara, Che, whatever. But like he built in the refugee camp of Al-Shati by the beach in Gaza. He built the walls of his home as double walls in a way that he could move within the entire architecture undetected. So when the soldiers, and it was Ariel Sharon at the time, who kind of was tasked with crushing the resistance, after 67. The Israelis call it the 6 Days War. Palestinians often call that time the 4 Years War, in kind of, as a critique of the Israeli
Hmm.
6 Days War. We've finished it. As it started in 67 and more or less kind of abetted in around 1971. So during that time, Sharon was coming into the refugee camp. Mainly, Al-Shati was one of the big center of resistance, and Al-Aswad was designing those buildings in a way that enabled movement between them, through them, and was, to my understanding, one of the first people that have connected two buildings in a refugee camp with a tunnel. and kind of all sort of little architectural inventions. There were nothing like the tunnels that later existed in Gaza. And but it was a way in which even that kind of system that the Israeli army was very, kind of proud of itself in instituting, and it's basically kind of a theft uh, of techniques of resistance that kind of built the refugee camp into a continuous fabric on multiple layers that is connected and interconnected in a way that enable smooth maneuver through it.
Mhm.
So that is really, I don't know, just pong to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking, I love that you use syntax and we're thinking about sort of the grammar of violence, the grammar of settler colonial movements and logics. But I found myself thinking again, the through line, and I appreciate that you're sort of drawing for us literally the through line. Like, why would we connect spatiality and the creation of space with smear campaigns? Is that there's a similar logic that's followed, right? And it's about expanding and contracting space, to my mind, as I hear you speak, to create new modes of domination and conquer, right? And there isn't a, I think sometimes, one of the things you were highlighting is there doesn't have to be respect for the actual architecture that's there. To the contrary, it's about there's almost an exploitation or a perversion of the space
Yeah.
with intent to create new modes of domination. It's not like it's a never-ending sort of process of expanding space.
Mm,
But the other thing that I'm also thinking about, and I wonder if, you can connect these things for us, is that you're tracing a history of how people who struggle on the land, on their own land, have also always been involved in creating counter technologies to domination,
mm, mm,
right?
mm, mm,
And that part of the way that systems like settler colonialism exact violence, and here I'm thinking psychically, is to give the semblance that all this space is ours, from
mm,
up top to below, and there's nothing that's yours. And
mm,
yet
mm,
there are these
mm,
histories that way predate October
mm,
2023 of of refusals and sort of insistence that like actually no, we're not only are we control of our space, but we actually know it better than you. And that's part
mm,
of sort of being locked into the land. But so
mm,
I'm,
mm, mm.
my mind's firing, in so many places, but those are the two threads that I find myself going.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Very interesting because kind of when you think about smear campaign as a kind of, okay, if I say that, I don't mean it in any way positively, but as the kind of production or perversion of knowledge, no? So it takes bits of information. We were just speaking about it before we started, no? So there's bits of, they'll pull a kind of quote from you on this podcast, two lines from a tweet, and would connect it in a way that is meant to either kind of politically, morally, or legally discredit you, right? To kind of like create a line to say like, okay, that is here something that is in violation of a code of ethics of a university, a code of ethics of a broadcaster, and this is usually what we are facing with, because when we publish online, they have all sort of journalistic codes of ethics or professional codes. So it always, smear campaign has to work against a certain normative frame, or in relation to some normative framework, whether it is regulated in clearly as a law or as a professional code of ethics or other red lines that exist and kind of create something else from bits of what you say and basically cross that threshold and say, here is what it is. And therefore you need to be fired from your university, dumped from this broadcaster, not receive funding because you violate funding codes, etc. So again, it's like it's a narrative that is drawn against a threshold that and it's meant to prove that you have traversed that threshold. Now, sometimes we happily traverse threshold as we enjoy, and as it is absolutely necessary to do in the service of liberation, Palestine liberation being one, and a very important one. And sometimes tactically we are aware that we're doing it, but sometimes that is actually weaponizing us. It's kind of like it's the same old story of like saying you're a smuggler by running the border over you, right? Running the normative threshold across what you're saying. So I think that there's, in a way, basically what I'm trying to do now, Lara, is kind of like describe the reality that we're facing in somehow spatial
Yes.
terms. No, here is a line, and here is where they kind of put you in relation to it. And here's the construction. Here is the vehicle that cross you that line. You always to cross any form of transgression needs a vehicle that does that, and the vehicle is constructed through this kind of composition of quotes, etc. And that is, yeah. So, okay. But I think there's also a limit to the kind of spatial practice, smear campaign metaphors that we could do. And I wonder we can go from here to many different directions, wherever you want to.
Yeah. I mean, I find myself as there's a way in which you're talking also about rearranging space. I mean, you said that at the beginning. It is primarily also about dominating sort of the means, who owns the means to rearrange space, but also claim not only ability but authority to do so, whereas other folks like guerrillas or all that are always already suspect if they use space differently, right? Even though that's central to what you're saying is the sort of logics of domination or settler colonialism really relies on the ability in semblance or symbolic forms or literally to rearrange space. But I'm thinking, and maybe this is just squarely in the spatial, not having to do with smear or anything, just because I'm very interested in your thoughts
Yeah,
around
yeah,
that.
yeah.
In rearranging space, there's also this sort of way in which you're creating another space that wasn't there before,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
That then becomes dominated, but then you use that space as an excuse of like, see, this is why I actually needed to dominate. It's almost like a creation of a space to further along the logics of your actual violent project. And it's a continuous process of recreating the,
exactly.
those spaces. But I don't know if you had more
No,
to.
absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that, this is exactly what settler colonialism does. It erases and it rewrites. So in order to rewrite, you need to kind of wipe the slate clean. But it's not nothing quite always is a remainder.
Mhm.
There's always something there. So, here, let's take a concrete example. Now we were working with Salman Abu Sitta now on the reconstruction of Al Main, one of the biggest and very important Palestinian Bedouin villages that was left outside of what became the Gaza Strip after the Nakba. Okay. And so we were really mapping every route there and every structure and all the agricultural practices with an agricultural expert called Mohammed Abu Jayab, who's really helped us understand, when they say us, Salman and forensic architecture, to do that. And there's something very beautiful that we came across. So particularly in this part of Palestine, the villages tend to be less dense. So it's not like houses cluttered together, a main market square and mosque or school and whatever other public functions kind of would exist. And it tends to be kind of scattered because the area was more arid, etc. And what becomes important instead of roads, we're talking again about syntax,
Yeah.
and grammar, is that you see sometimes in very old British aerial images from the Second World War that can photograph the area. And they're not in excellent resolution, but you can see the routes that people walked along, because sometimes across fields, and when people walk along a particular route, the plants die along that route and it registers differently. And then you start understanding what you're seeing, and you're seeing a bundle of threads. And that bundle of threads is a kind of a pattern of life that connects a well and a house and a field and a school and whatever, a shop in a particular area. And as long as people are there, they, those things relate to a particular family or particular village. So therefore, the repetition of walking, there's nothing that is constructed architecturally. It's just a way of walking, create that. And you start seeing affiliation between objects that are physical and, they just don't change. A well and a house, etc. They are static. But that's the dynamic link. And then we look at the same area after the Nakba. See, look at it in the 50s. And all the bits are there, and the roads are different.
Mm.
And you understand that the set of relation that connects the existing bones, let's say, are very different. And Salman was asking us, why did they remove our roots? Even if they came and they took our land, they stole it. And I wanted to, they were perfectly good. They were designed to, we harvested barley, they harvested barley, and particularly what was interesting is the necessity to rewrite it, to rewrite the relation between those objects that still remain, that were not erased. And so the entire circulation system is the relation between things. It's actually set of almost invisible network, a social network, if you like, that connects physical objects. And this is, again, another manifestation, just like the soldiers walking through walls, and effectively the body movement in space is what organizes space rather than the body moves through designated routes,
Right.
right?
Right.
That is the kind of settler colonial violence. And in particular, just I'll end by saying that and I think that forensic architecture is now working, as providing the evidence for the South Africa legal team. And a lot of the big question, when you have a genocide case, it's a question of intent. Now, I mean, you would know more than anyone else that intent, I mean, it's like it's about what one wants. It's so difficult to know what one wants oneself, let alone an entire system. But there are, in intent, um, it's about an intent of a system, an intent of a settler colonial system or a state or an army. It's about a set of relation between different acts.
Mhm.
So it's not the genocide in a genocide case is not like you collect war crime after war crime after war crime after war crime, then you cross a threshold. It's so many war crimes that it must be a genocide. It's not how it works. It needs to be built into a system that reflects a certain intent. And intent is also not something that would have erupted if in a particular legal argument, the genocide began, let's say, after October 7th, you know, intent need to form over time. And in that sense, looking at space is very useful to build that, because space and architecture that is imposed over an area is precisely what represents intent. Because, when an architect builds your home, it's a translation of a certain will into an organizational system. No?
Mhm. Mhm.
And when we were looking at the physical, when we look onto Gaza, I mean, it's just like it's so heartbreaking, and every day in Gaza is worse than the previous one, um, and is worse than any other day that was in the history of Palestine. And it's very hard to pull out and to kind of like to see shapes within this carnage.
Yeah.
But when you when you look at this not as a collection of things, and you look at the way in which Gaza has been both erased and rebuilt at the same time.
Mhm.
It's a demolition site and is at a construction site.
Mm.
And when I say construction site, not in a good sense of the word, I mean it's been built into a genocidal machine,
Mhm.
and it's been reorganized. Not only have entire neighborhood, historical neighborhood that is so important for Palestinian history, like Sajaya, like Jabalia, etc., like Rafat el Sultan, completely destroyed.
Mm.
But you see the formation of a different spatial logic that is superimposed over that area that has been called since 48 the Strip, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, it's there's infrastructure lines that cut it all of a sudden. It's divided in a different way. There is this entire architecture of starvation that is being imposed onto it. And it is being built out of the ruins of what it was. So it's built out of the same material.
Mm.
So Jabalia is turned into the construction material, the rubble of that refugee camp that is so important, not the place where the first intifada of the 80s began and so connected to Palestinian liberation struggle is is becoming the rubble with which berms and walls and corridors and what have this horrible feeding stations that they're building. And
Mhm.
this is actually more in the south. This Tel el Sultan is the part that, in fact, this entire camp that used to be called the Canada camp has been turned into rubble with which Israel construct the architecture of false humanitarianism that is imposing on that. So it is using the same vocabulary, the
Mm.
same concrete in a different way,
Mhm.
because Israel is not bringing building material, it's taking bulldozers and taking the rubble and pulling the rubble into lines and enclosures and
Right.
all this kind of system of infrastructure. So that's, you rewrite with the same material in
Mm.
which life was composed of,
Mhm.
is being used as building material to impose an architecture. And architecture, again, is so important because architecture is the manifestation of intent. And then you say architecture is a bit of technology. It's,
Right.
every house, buildings, etc. They're more than that, but they're also technologies of living, technologies of educating, technology of
Right.
medical care, whatever it is. And you say, what is this tool for? What is this organization designed to do? And the minute you bring the word design, the intent is this beyond all the manifestation and declaration of pure genocidal intent that were there. You can see it in space in the clearest way rather than in the incidents.
Right. Right. I mean, it's so important what you're drawing out for us. And I also hear an invitation in there. Maybe that's an odd way of thinking about it. But I also see Jessie. Hey, Jessie. We'll
Hey.
we'll
Hi,
we'll
Jesse.
draw you in. We'll draw you in here. And feel free, Jessie, also to jump in around this. But it seems like you're saying in many ways you're saying it's not enough just to crush people. That is part, obviously, the intent of settler colonialism, of violence, is to erase people. But also, if we're bringing in the idea of spatiality, and I think Yulia had put in as like an actual um, machinery of settler colonial violence is to reorganize these things and use architecture as a part of that. It's also to rearrange spatially. Certainly, the invitation I hear as we're talking about this, whether it's smear campaign or through this or through a rearrangement of architecture and using it as a weapon of construction for further violence, not in the generative way that you're talking about, is an invitation for us to be attuned to the signs of life, not only that were there prior, but that continue to find ways to create counter technologies against that construction. right? Because as I
Yeah.
hear you talking about those aerial photos, one of the things that I think about is that one, it's not just that those exist, it's that one must be attuned to the existence of those paths. Because the same, another person can look at that and entirely miss that there's an entire psychodynamic sort of connectivity of life there, and just
Yeah.
accept the fact of the overlay of settler colonialism, right?
You
And
know,
so,
it's like so sorry to interrupt. Just I'm gonna just say a little comment and return it to you. It's like you take an aerial image taken by an imperial army, the British Royal Air Force, no, in 1945, in a war still, and they're looking from the top down. Now the question is, how do you look at the same material at an aerial image from the bottom up? Meaning, you look at an aerial image from the ground up.
mhm,
A, a, a slight detail on, when you go into, okay, so when the kind of way of attuning to trace that I'm talking about in Almain is not really by looking at photograph. You don't see any recognizable. You go down to the level of the grain and you see a slight disturbance. You see, I don't know, 3 grains or 3 pixels kind of organized in a line. And that could be a scratch on a negative, and that could be a dam, or that could be a little wall, or that could be a path. The only lived knowledge of that place, meaning looking at the image from the bottom up,
yeah,
not from the top down, would allow you to interpret what it is that you see. And the minute that you anchor knowledge, situated knowledge, within the organization of grains in a silver salt halyard on some negative, it's that relation that matters, no? And that this is, and then lived reality allows you to do a counter reading of things. Sorry, it was a bit too long, but
no,
I
to the
realized,
contrary.
back to you.
Yeah, no, to the contrary. And I think this is an important piece for us that as we're talking about these things again as a logic, I, personally, maybe this is my personal thing, is I want us also to be simultaneously attuned to the ways that counter logics work, counter readings, that this isn't just about unadulterated power to rewrite situated knowledge, experiential knowledge, landed knowledge. The technologies of settler colonialism will work to do that all the time and invade space. And then there's again, this is the invitation for me, is how do we read against that? And um, my feeling is that part of what we're trying to do in the Institute is create a discourse that contests
Mm,
the space,
incredible. Yeah,
right? Is
yeah.
test this space, offer counter readings, disseminate this discourse like you're talking about. So I'm really appreciative. And Jessie, I'm so happy you're with
Hi,
us.
Jesse.
Hey,
I'm gonna drop your bio into the chat. No
okay.
worries. This is our life right now. So we're good. We're gonna roll with the punches.
So my life right now.
But I don't know how much you caught of what Eyal and I were just talking about, and I know you've done a lot of work around the space of the internet, certainly around smears and all that, but it seems like we were just talking about how it is about also creating more spaces that then can be dominated and sort of used as part of the logic of violence. So if you want to jump in with some thoughts around that, and then maybe
Yeah, go ahead.
you all, if you want to respond, and then maybe we can open up. I know there are some questions also from folks.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would say about the current campaigns of smear and attack that are happening within academia is that they really are designed to unsettle our day-to-day lives. So when I got attacked by the far right back in 2017, and they set upon my work email, my personal email, every social media platform, and what I realized in that moment was that I could no longer actually do my job to the extent that part of my job now exists in what we're calling cyberspace here. So my work email, I couldn't actually just ignore the hate-filled, death threats, rape threats, all that kind of vitriol that came through my email. I couldn't just set that aside and respond to student emails, for example, because it was so overwhelming. You couldn't find the actual work emails in that. And there's something about that when so much of our lives now are digitally mediated through these spaces and these tools. To have those invaded, to use the terminology that we're framing this discussion in, to have those invaded feels like a very personal attack, and it also feels like a very unsettled way of being because while it's attacking me in my public role as a professor, it also feels very, very private and personal. And the response at the time, we have a different administration where I work now, but at the time the response was sort of, well, what did you do to bring this on? I mean, to me, it was very analogous to the kinds of things that are said to sexual assault survivors. Like, what were you wearing? Why were you in that location? That kind of thing. So I think that there's a real way that they have found to use these tools that are so much a part of our daily lives to then turn them into forms of attack. And I think that's really kind of where we are right now. I mean, the other thing I'll say is that they've also been very innovative in terms of technology. So last was fall of 23 when a far right group scraped a bunch of names of me and my colleagues who had signed on to a letter of support for Palestine and used those signatures to then create malicious websites and put our names and our faces on a truck saying, CUNY's leaning anti-Semite and circulated that LED truck around our campus. And so again, it was this kind of pulling apart of what is public and what is private and using technology to attack us.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking to say, there was a comment by Shirina Razak in the chat talking about the elasticity. And there she was talking about border imperialism more broadly, the elasticity of borders. But I'm found myself as I read that note thinking about what both of you are talking about the elasticity, the ability to contract and then fall back in, right? Is that contraction? I think sometimes we're sort of lured into the ever expanding nature of this, the elasticity, but part of elasticity is also the ability to kind of contract when needed. So I'm wondering if both of you from your position can talk about how this works, the ever expanding, but then also the clapdown when needed as a way to use space, whether that's cyberspace or literal space too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a way. I'm not sure I can really respond to these really excellent questions that are in the chat, but I mean, I think that there is a way in which, like white supremacy, there is a way in which it expands and contracts in a way that perpetuates its evolution. But I think that in those moments of expanding and contracting, that there are opportunities for disruption, that there are opportunities for resistance in those. And we see those sort of in the ground, on the ground in these street protests where people are, sort of coming to realize how much power there is in the numbers and how we outnumber these forces. And I also think that there's an opportunity when there are divisions in the far right and in these forces that are trying to come after us, that we can sort of puncture those divisions. So I'll give it to anyone else that wants to respond.
Yeah, I can try also to respond to that. I think that the way I understand it from kind of a theory of space elasticity is that um, it comes to kind of theory of elasticities come to contest the imagination that space is oppressive when it is static and overpowering, meaning, images of what communicates to us as oppressive space, the wall in West Bank or fortresses or any kind of borders. No, they kind of tend to communicate like oppressive spatiality. But I think that effectively spatial formation that are much more deadly are those that are constantly changing. And space is deadly at the moment of its changing, not at the moment when it's static and fortress-like. And settler colonial frontiers are exactly these kind of gelatinous spaces that are made and remade at the will of the colonizer. So it is not really the kind of static elements that put something under siege or divide, but it's the fact that, you look at space in transformation. It is actually the act of transforming space, the process by which one kind of lived environment, a city, a refugee camp, a village, etc., is kind of being morphed, transformed into the other, into something else. And this is what we're seeing in Gaza. We're not seeing a static architecture. And if you think of it, the architectural element of this genocide is piled earth, is bulldozers piled earth. And you see it everywhere. And these are like dunes that are moving, and they're moving wherever the occupation army is moving. And just like like moving dunes, drifting dunes, you say, or something like that. Yeah. So the army enters into a particular city or village. It's carved as it goes a path. It piles the ruins of that city or village into two berms on its sides, right? Because they kind of protect themselves from guerrilla attacks from snipers or RPG. Then they move and they take these formation and do something else with it. And the same earth berm that went along the road is now doing a kind of like an enclosure, and that's a torture camp. Where Palestinian of military age men usually are being kind of tortured to death within those sites. Sometimes those berms, we've been following this kind of like, sorry to say, this gelatinous earth. So the Gaza Strip is otherwise a relatively flat surface, but the genocide has turned it into a stormy kind of landscape of those drifting dunes. And those dunes do everything that architectural elements do. They do towers, so they kind of like rise up into high berms, and there's a sniper there, or a bit of technology, or a camera, wherever they are, or something like that on it. And they make walls for this like detention camps, as we were talking about before. They make barriers. They make all sort of military camps, and then the military moves away, and they get formed in a particular way. So this is what I'm talking about: is elasticity is the power of a space, is not to put a kind of a dam wall like in the West Bank. It is the process of kind of turning solid into jelly and continuously transforming it and turning it into a kind of a mechanism of death. And then we are seeing, like in again in Tel El Sultan, where they murdered the medics, back in, when was it, in April. They have actually put the earth berm over them, over the ambulances. So these are like graves. And then we were seeing also the occupation forces digging out cemeteries, both in Al Shifa in the courtyard, and also in all across Gaza, digging up cemeteries and piling them into this kind of like horrible demonic landscape. And that is the power of architecture. And it looks, it's just earth. No, it looks it doesn't look benign, but it doesn't look as oppressive photographically as, the concrete wall. But the concrete wall is just done and it's just there.
Right. I'm really so appreciating this conversation because I'm thinking as you're speaking, yeah, I'm thinking about Jesse's sort of again call to us saying there are opportunities for resistance here. And as I'm thinking about the gelatinous sort of change and that the most dangerous time is when things are shifting or appear in many ways, what both of you are saying is when they appear innocent, but they're actually being used because it's all part of a lot like how do you expand your range of what you use towards violence or genocidal aims or settler colonial aims and reconfiguring space. But I'm thinking, here's where I'm bringing in the psychic Yulia. I hear you that part of what I've been thinking about a lot during this year and a half, but certainly more than that too, is the ways in which the psychic is a target. And the point of that is to reconfigure the psychic space and the topography of our interior. It's not just in constant movement. But, and this is the place where Jesse's pull for resistance is. If we follow the logic that it's the most dangerous time when it's shifting, is that also another Shireen had mentioned, sort of feminist praxis and resistance in all spaces? If we know that, if we're sort of attuned to that or can expect that this moment of change is the most dangerous, is that also the moment where the most committed resistance can happen and a contestation of where that gelatinous blob goes ends up happening in those moments? Like it's at those moments of transformation or shifts that we also need to push against the seams and offer a counterforce that can guide that or transform that into a different beast, so to speak. Again, whether that's on the ground, in architecture, in cyberspace, in our academics, wherever it is, if we're following this warning that you all are giving, it seems like we're also saying, here's your space of action.
Yeah, I'll just add one other thing. I was thinking when Eyal was talking about the architecture and how it gets reshaped in a way that reinforces these systems of oppression. I was just thinking about how, to extend your point, Lara, the way that that really is happening psychodynamically, it's happening internally. And I think that to be able to resist, we have to, do the really difficult self work of understanding when we're destabilized psychodynamically. And I just, in the last year and a half, I've just been struck by how many of my colleagues in academia and outside of it are responding out of old patterns and out of trauma and not really sort of reflecting on how they're being activated psychodynamically by all of these geopolitical forces. And so I
Mhm.
so I think that I think especially on the left that we have to do the really challenging thing of both paying attention to what's happening internally, but not stop there and sort of connect it to these broader struggles. And I think that's really where we get shut down a lot of times.
Mhm. 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 Eyal, you had started, or you unmuted. Just giving you space.
Oh, no, no. I I think that yeah, resistance is one term, and it does important work sometimes, and creation is another, and does important work in another time. Sometimes those entangle and work together. Um, and creation is less reactive, maybe sometimes in its um, kind of spirit. But I think that earthing. So if you look from the perspective, kind of like, we're talking about the aerial images before, bird eye view. Let's talk about the warm eye view, though without doing any, kind of reference to animal metaphors. So forgive me if this is what it connotes. But from the earth, looking at that conflict as one a conflict, I mean, not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the resistance as a process of earthing, you would see enormous amount of earth shifting in the subsoil. People were talking, I don't know, a decade ago, it was very popular to talk about the Anthropocene as a kind of something that shifts soils around. I mean, the amount of soil that has been shifted from one side or another in the sub, in the over, in the south western coast of Palestine, as I prefer to call the region that is now where the genocide now takes place, is incredible, and also all those earth practices that come with it. And so I was very struck by also when we did the reconstruction for Maine with Salman Abu Sita, the depth of the well that was in Al Main. So it's about 8 kilometers, 3 kilometers from Han Yunis, 8 kilometers from the coastline, and they had to go 100 meters down to get fresh water. Now, to get 100 meters down, and the well is narrow. It's like less than a meter in diameter. So it's like a needle, 100 to 1 in proportion, like a needle going into the earth. As an architect, again, going so deep and so straight into the earth is an engineering feat that is not less than building a 100-meter tower. Now you try to build a 100-meter tower that is 1 meter, right? And the earth is moving, and there's all sort of processes. There's water, there is drift, there is soil, there is sand, there is all those things happening there. And still, there is a knowledge of the subsoil that existed with farmers made dispossessed of their land and expelled into this strip of land. And they knew how to traverse the layers of sandstone and clay and loess, which is the local type of soil, very, very kind of viscous soil in this part of Palestine, and knew what to do and how to extract this earth and what to do with that. And actually, for the tunnel project, all that was needed was the horizontal connection. But the project emerged out of the local creation of understanding that how the subsoil is important for life on the soil.
Mhm.
And I think that, in the subsoil usually emerges in literature, in culture, in our imagination, where the earth becomes uninhabitable, where there is an ecological, nuclear, any other catastrophe on the surface. And settler colonialism is definitely that kind of nuclear bomb that has landed onto the surface. To survive, you need to go into the subsoil. It is the means of survival. It's a means of creation. It's a means of resistance. And it is based on a much more nuance than the D9 bulldozer piling, bits of neighborhoods into walls. Much more fine understanding of the layers of the earth, because in the subsoil, even if, let's say, the surface of Gaza is not straight, but let's just say it's straight, right? I mean, it's actually interesting why it's not straight, but I'll not go into that because it has all sort of like geological features going. But let's say it's straight. The layering of the clay and sand and loess are drawing an invisible subterranean topography. It's not like a single dark medium that you just bore through. Every layer of soil has a different texture, has a different meaning. If you go for a tunnel, you want to go through clay because clay is like a clay vessel. Now it's strong. But the clay goes up and goes down and turns right, and it has its own topography. So there's the entire landscape, and it's a landscape without a silhouette. So it's an invisible landscape because it's just like it's just filled with other layers which do other things, that is inhabited, and there's a space creation in that. It kind of began with this like needle thin connection between the surface and the soil, which are the wells, and then moves into the topography. And I find that inspiring, and I find that also to be the reason that with like more than a year and a half of endless genocidal violence, they have they may have committed genocide, but they have not won the war. And Hamas is still there, and they occupy one space, they leave, boop, people pop up there again, and that is this is just, I think, one of the most incredible acts or architectures of creation and resistance that we've been actually exposed to. And again, in this conversation, I always say I speak as an architect because you can come from other disciplines. But I speak to architects. I never said do that, but like, yeah, as an architect, there's something that is incredibly inspiring.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. My partner Stephen just texted me. He said it's the terroir of resistance that you're talking about, which I find to be that's a good article
Meaning
title.
like the wine, the
Yeah, yeah,
terroir.
yeah. It's the same. Yeah, from
Yeah.
the
Tell
oil.
Stephen that in Gaza, one of the only places where you could cultivate grapes right by the coastline, because along Wadi Gaza, you have a huge clay that comes from Hebron. So the clay drains from the Hebron mountain down Wadi Gaza and then spills around Nuseirat to the sea. And there you had clay field, and you had one of the only places where you can have right by the beach. You can have your grapes and that produces a certain kind of wine that in Byzantine time, obviously it was less popular in the Muslim periods, but like in Byzantine time was very famous. And that wine was exported worldwide in the same earth in which it grew because it was clay. So the clay was baked into pot and the wine was put into it, was sent all over Europe.
I love, and that's what I mean about the attunement to life. Um, so I want to do a time check. Yeah, how are you doing on time? I think we have like 10 minutes. I want to try and get through some of the questions, but I don't know about your timing. Are you okay for 10 more minutes?
Sorry,
Jessie? Yeah.
yeah, what's the time? Okay, yeah, let me see. Yeah, I mean,
Okay. Amaya had a question. Maybe this goes into this. A similar question about responding to the destruction of space. Are there traps to be avoided? And maybe again, from our own angles, are there traps to be avoided? And we're thinking architecturally here, spatially thinking about it. We're thinking about cyberspace. I can, if we have time, I'll take up psychically, but I want to open it up to you two, especially.
sorry, I was looking at the time, but what was? I'm sorry to ask for the
It's
question again.
okay. Responding to the destruction of space, right?
Hmm.
Are there traps to be avoided? I think we're also following this line of resist, like it feels like we sort of through a theoretical map of space and how space is used and diffused. And now that we've been moving into how do we resist it? How do we sort of find space of intervention? Are there traps to be avoided? And Jesse, I saw you unmuted if you haven't thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly around technology, there are many traps to be avoided, and I think that for me, at the top of that list is not thinking about um, oppression in the design process. There's a whole field of sort of human computer design, and oftentimes that field of building things, of software developers and engineers and that sort of thing, are designing in this kind of false world where none of this exists, right? There's not settler colonialism, there's not white supremacy. They exist in this fantasy world of sort of color blindness and outside of geopolitics. And that's actually quite by design. If you go back and look at, John Perry Barlow and the Declaration of Independence in cyberspace, I mean, the early ideas in the 1990s were about designing a cyberspace that was not controlled by government. And so there was a way in which that was early on in the sort of thought process of some of these tech, you know, not all of them were billionaires then, but the tech oligarchy, as Carol Cadwalladr has called them. And I think that really is kind of the flaw, the mistake that we keep making with technology. I've often said that you cannot think about technology correctly without thinking about race, and you cannot think about race without thinking about technology. And that's equally true when we're talking about settler colonialism and the genocide in Gaza. You really, I mean, most of the technology that is being used to hunt down and murder people at scale has been developed in collaboration with these tech giants that are based here in the United States. So it's a colonial project across national borders. And I think that too often there is a way in which trying to push back against technology lets the whole design process of tech off the hook. And I think that we really have to look at how these technologies are being created in the first place and how they're being designed in this way that not only doesn't take into account but often works in service of empire, and I think that's the real root of it that we have to address.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I think another, just to kind of build a bridge to what Jesse is saying. I mean, not directly, but kind of, um, the genocide is producing an enormous amount of data. It's also a data practice. It is based on incessant calculations on every scale, on, existing remaining vegetation in Gaza, on numbers of people in particular places, number of calories that they need, how to starve them, how to move them, facial recognition, pattern recognition, data behavior of people, keeping, checking in on families and friends, networks between people in Gaza and people worldwide that are being exposed and are being monitored. All that, this genocide is a data event. It's a huge data event. And that data, a lot of the data has been harvested, mined, fracked by Israel now. And it is when you would receive data services in the future, it's very possible. I mean, it's almost impossible not to. It would be based on, algorithm trained on this data set that is so complete and extracted without any, obviously, to say it, extracted without a consent of the people feelings like so, like we don't understand where we are. But, obviously, stolen from people. Um, and particularly, what is being concerning is the networks, and we all do that because we all know people in Gaza and we care about and we're in contact with, and then we call other people in our network, in wherever other countries, and all this topology of activism and concern, all this labor of care, right? That many other ways to call those sets of relation is being harvested, and that topology of relation of activists and Palestinians in diaspora and in Palestine is being kind of monitored. And that it's through the data that the genocide is extending the footprint. The data footprint of it is much, much bigger. It's coextensive with the world. So I think this is really, it's not so much like, the Caterpillar selling the D9 or the one-ton bombs or the this or that, the F-50, 35. It's the data that is going to be, um, for decades, I think now, going to be weaponized.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, One final question. I think it ties into this because you were just saying sort of data, and then just you were talking about like almost we look at the symptom rather than the root of what's happening. That's how I'm translating it. But Stephen was talking about like the brute violence of this, whether it's through architecture or through a smear campaign, that there actually is of violence that has to happen. It's not enough to just collect the data. I think it's really important to say there are nodal points and there are all these ways in which we collect data about people, about relationships, about the psychodynamics of networks of care and networks of solidarity. And then there seems to be a hard line where violence has to actually be enacted right? And that's the brute force of that. And I'm wondering if we could sort of wind down our talk today around like what we're actually seeing in these logics ends up being, right, brute force, brute violence. And maybe we can, I mean, I could keep talking to both of you forever, but I guess we have to end somewhere. So if you want to have the last say around these thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important thing to focus on in terms of the of what's at stake here. I think it's very easy to have these discussions and sort of um, you know, go way too abstract about what we're talking about, but these are people's lives, and these are really, I mean, we're really seeing the violence of the state enacted over and over again. And I do think that there's hope in the people who are resisting that state violence, both within these tech companies and outside of them. But yeah, I think it's really important to focus on the sort of horrific violence that these technologies and the settler colonial project behind them enact.
Yeah. It's not an abstraction.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is experienced as brute force. And I think that this is something that is really worth kind of like keeping front and center. When you're punched, shot, bombed, starved, etc., the kind of the system that is behind it is not what you experience. You experience its brute kind of reality, and that is, and I think that at the moment, this is the kind of the face of violence we need to foreground.
Mhm.
And if there is, there was before some question about what are the traps, etc. And we always need to remind ourselves of these traps, because we provide assistance for, legal processes and political processes and I don't know, cases here in the UK of weapon export, etc. And you need to analyze and analyze and analyze and analyze. And sometimes when you do that, you need to remind yourself of that, the kind of the sharp edge of violence and the experience. Because if you take the experience out of that, um, I think you're also you're just a kind of a disassociated researcher in academia,
Mhm.
rather than a person that operates initially through uh, empathy with how compromised it is, because nobody can feel like what nobody can even begin to feel what it feels like, but the attempt, that's the paradox. You have to put yourself every day in that place. You
Yeah.
have to try to imagine yourself into that place, because that this is, I think, the kind of the moral impact, with understanding the impossibility of doing so
Yeah.
across identities, across places, across borders. It's impossible to do that.
Yeah.
And yet you have to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think it just brings us back around to say to
I
ground us.
think you're muted, or maybe just my thing is not
Can
working.
you hear me?
I can
Just
hear you.
Okay, something I don't hear.
so it sort of
Doesn't
grounds
matter.
us back. It grounds us back in Palestine. It sort of allows us to work again from the soil up, from the and to sort of really focus on that. I do want to thank you both so much. It's been such a pleasure to be engaged with you. Again, I have like 3 pages of notes that I've made, just making my mind go all over the place. Very appreciative of everybody joining us and supporting the work of the Institute. Again, if you want to think about places to put your money for us to keep thinking alongside you. We would love that. And then a reminder that next Friday, June 20th at 2 p.m., there's another part of the series, and it's called Your Kufiyeh Scares Me, Weaponizing Safety as Zionist Smear Tactics. So onward we go in thinking through and then also in creating spaces of resistance. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking out of your time. I really appreciate it.